Welcome to MFP Live. I'm Donna Ladd, the editor of the Mississippi Free Press. And my co host tonight and always is Kimberly Griffin, the publisher of the Mississippi Free Press. Hey, Kimberly.
Hello.
And so tonight we're going to continue our conversation about what we kind of, for short, call at the Mississippi Free Press the BWC Project. And what that project is, I mean, the name of it now officially, the name kind of evolved as we did the reporting on the project, but the name of the project now officially is Inequity and Resilience, and then Black Women, Systemic Barriers, and COVID-19. And if you haven't seen it yet, the URL is there. It was on the screen and it'll be back. We started dropping the project last week, and it's on a microsite that you can get to through the Mississippi Free Press site or directly at that link. It's a collaboration between the Mississippi Free Press and the Jackson Advocate, a whole bunch of great women working together on this project. And it's been going, we've been building up to it and doing the reporting and, figuring this thing out for a year at least. It has initial support from the Solutions Journalism Network because the idea of the project ultimately is to find and report solutions to the issues that we find or that the reporters are finding. I do mostly digging into history for this project and editing some, but what the reporters are finding as they kind of go into these deep dives in what's so far 3 counties where they're doing the reporting, Noxabee, or as I'm told by the other 2 women in the room, they say it there, Noxabee, which I had no idea. Did I say that other pronunciation right? Noxabee. See, that doesn't even come out well for me. Anyway, I'll practice. But anyway, so Noxabee County, where we're focusing in on education. Hinds County will be the next one to drop, and that's Aaliyah Veal, a reporter from Mississippi Free Press, who is the focus there of this project is community violence and safety. And then the third one is Holmes County, which is about healthcare and access to healthcare. And Asia Wiggins is, who's deputy editor at the Mississippi Free Press, is working on that project. So that I'll say this very briefly, and then we'll get into a conversation about it that hopefully will help clarify it to everyone. But the point of the project was when COVID-19 hit Black women the hardest of any group in the early months, including Black men, and that wasn't the same everywhere. When that happened, we wanted to know why. And as I wrote in a column this week, our assumption was that it is because of the existing inequities and disparities, historic, that have been passed forward into current generations, and that are particularly difficult on Black women in Mississippi. And the Black Women's Roundtable has done amazing work on that, has just a unbelievable and devastating report out on what Black women face in Mississippi due to inequities. But we saw this as a window, COVID-19 as a window into existing systemic problems and inequities, so that we could then go in and look closer and elucidate, if you will, what those inequities are, and in some ways prove that they exist. And so this one is for Noxabee County, that's on the screen in front of you. And we were very lucky on this particular project. It just kind of fell in place. And so I'm going to introduce you to our guests tonight. We may have another guest joining us, but Torsheta Jackson. Hello, Torsheta. Torsheta is from Noxabee County, grew up there, and she's going to tell you more about her background here in a little bit. But she's a longtime teacher and she's done a lot of things, but she's a powerhouse of a woman. But she's also a freelance journalist, and that's how I got to know her. She had started freelancing for us a while back, and so it just kind of made sense that what Torsheta would take on in this project was education focus in her home county. And when we did that, I didn't know a whole lot about the county. And now I feel like it's the center of the world. So welcome, Torsheta. Tickled to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
So what I thought we would do first, and then I'm going to kick it to Kimberly because she is not as mired in the project as we are, so she can ask questions and get us to, explain whatever she wants explained. But the first thing I'd like for you to do, Torsheta, is just tell people a little bit about yourself, about growing up in Noxabee, anything you want to talk about around that.
Okay. Well, like Donna said, Noxabee is home for me. And so this project took on some very personal levels for me. I grew up in Noxabee County. I spent my whole entire life there. My mother was actually a teacher in the Noxabee County School District for 31 years. And then she spent 12, I believe, years on the Noxabee County School Board. My father began teaching in Noxabee County and then became an instructor at East Mississippi Community College, which is right next door in neighboring Scuba, Mississippi. So education was the center of my family. I'm an only child, and so I was lavish with all of that love and education in my home. I'm originally from Sugar Lock, which is probably the smallest town in Noxabee County, and the one that you see in the photos that has really just gone from a thriving railroad town to almost a ghost town. But yeah, I grew up there. I went to Noxabee County High School. I went to Reed Elementary School, which we could not even get a picture of because a storm has devastated it and it is now fenced around. And then I went to Earl Nash Elementary School. Then I went to B.F. Liddell Middle School and finished at Noxabee High School. I actually finished top of my class in Noxabee High School. I graduated number 1 in my class before going on to the University of Southern Mississippi. But what was interesting to me when I left Noxabee and went on to college was that I did not realize how much we were kind of lacking. And it wasn't for effort of our teachers. It wasn't that they weren't trying to give us the best education. Now that I've been a teacher for 17 years, I realized there was just simply a lack of resources. Textbooks cost money, novels cost money, and Noxabee County just didn't have the money that it took to kind of keep us on board with some of the more exclusive schools, I'll say that, in the state. But it was a very loving and friendly community. And I think the thing that stuck with me and the thing that I hope comes out in this project is that especially Black women there, but women there, people there have tried their very best to do what they could with what they had. They have tried their very best to educate with what they had, but there are so many systemic conditions that have kind of pushed them further and further and deeper into almost a hole that is, as Dr. Mullen says, nearly impossible to dig out of. And so that is my experience growing up in Noxabee County. And like Donna said, I have been a teacher for 17 years. And so I kind of get to look at it from two perspectives, from a former alumni and now a teacher.
So you talk about growing up in Noxabee County and then going to USM and realizing there were some serious educational inequities. If you don't mind, I don't want to, you have to tell me your age, but about when were you a student there and what was it like before you were a student? Do people talk about how it was different, how it had changed?
I was a student I graduated from Noxabee County in 1998. I don't mind saying that. So I left Noxabee County and went immediately to the University of Southern Mississippi. A conversation I've never had before I started this project with anyone, we've never had a conversation about the inequities. We've never had a conversation about what we felt like we missed. It was very interesting to me when I was interviewing Shawanda Reedus that she said that. She actually said, I went to state and I said, oh no, I need to go get a job, because it's something that's kind of not discussed. But it was immediately apparent to me. And even before I got to USM, I mentioned that I graduated #1 in my class. I also graduated Star Student. And what was interesting, we came down to Mississippi College for the Star Student ceremony. And of course, the Star Student is the student from across the state. Well, then it was a student with the highest ACT score. It has changed a little bit then. I mean, a little bit now. But you would hear these students who were taking astronomy and mythology, and we didn't know what that was. We weren't offered those courses. We had no idea that was a high school thing. And I think that for me was the first idea that the education that I had received was different than the education someone else was receiving. The next time that I realized that was when I was in college. And I distinctly remember it being my English class. And English was somewhere I had always felt really strong in high school. But I got there and I realized I was very lacking in some of the skills that I needed to do what I wanted to do, which took a lot more work for me, writing centers and things of that nature. And of course, you adapt and you accommodate, but then you start to really realize these are things that I didn't learn in high school. And I reiterate, I had great teachers, but I think that it was a lack of resources. I just don't think we had the same resources that other schools had.
And when you were in school, what was it, an all-black school? Was it mixed race? Was the school system what was the racial makeup?
It was almost 100%, probably 99.9. I do remember having one or two white classmates. I specifically remember one white classmate whose parents were very intent on her attending the public schools. They were very into the public schools and working in the public schools. Her mother taught there.
Right.
So there may have been one or two, but I mean, we were probably 99.9% Black.
And the white students in the county went to the academy?
They went to Central Academy. And Central Academy is the subject of Donna Ladd's awesome piece. But yes, and from what we found out doing our research, when the schools integrated, the president of the school board, or the superintendent at the time, I think he was, opened or helped to open Central Academy, which is a segregation academy, for lack of a better word. And so the white students migrated to Central Academy. Within 2 years, I believe we found that there were only about 12 students left. So I think integration was 2 years after integration, I'll say that there were about 12 white students left. And then the Mennonite schools opened, which pretty much took the rest of those students in the next couple of years. And so within 3 or 4 years of integration, Noxabee County schools were predominantly, heavily, nearly 100% Black. And they have remained that way. There has been some fluctuation in the past few years. They picked up a few more white students. They've also picked up some Hispanic students, but it is still heavily, heavily Black.
I'll let Donna take it, but I did have one thing. I didn't realize that there were Mennonite schools until this project. That's number one. And I went to school at the W, and the Mennonites used to set up and sell baked goods. Mississippi University for Women, for people who don't know, in North Mississippi. It was my first time seeing Mennonites. It was the best bread I'd ever eaten in my life, because obviously it's made of butter and love. And so, but I was like, what is this? Is this what bread's supposed to taste like? But I just had no idea. And so people who are not Mennonite can go to the Mennonite schools?
That may be a better question for Donna. I'm not sure.
I dug into the Mennonites. That's the reason I'm sitting over here going, I got you. Well, okay, let me back up for a second, then I'll answer that question, because I think it's in the story. So what I did, I went over to Noxabee County. I'm still practicing saying it like y'all say it, but I'll get there. I went over there and met Torsheta there, and we had we're just what I thought was remarkable reporting together over there. And one of the things that we did is she just gave me a tour of the county, and she knows where all the boarded up schools are, and she knows where the boarded up businesses are. And I mean, it was just nothing quite like that tour that Torsheta gave. And I took like 700 pictures. I mean, it was just, but I learned so much by doing that. And there's a reporting hint in there too. Anybody listening who wants to be a reporter, but okay. So in all of that, I didn't know anything about the Mennonites there either. She took me to Central Academy, and I really urge you guys to read the Academy story, that the sidebar that I did, which kind of turned into its own story, because it talks about, I researched the history of this particular segregation academy, and it's not a pretty history. They closed in 2017. But somewhere in all this conversation, this is the reason I tell this whole long story, I think it was Torsheta, or either it was Dr. McCloud or Principal Brooks. One of them said something about white kids going to the Mennonite school. And I'm like, well, wait, what's that all about? So long story short, and I'll get to the answer to your question, Kimberly. What I did a lot of research on the Mennonite schools there, and the Mennonites who had immigrated to Noxabee County. The first ones were from Indiana, and they immigrated in like 1960. And this was their thing. I think it was like evangelization by colonization. And they were moving around the country looking for cheap land, cheap fertile land. And there was plenty of that from the old plantations in Noxabee County. Which is basically, we didn't say this up front, but it's always been a plantation type agricultural. That was its history. And it's always been majority Black, the whole county. And so, because it goes all the way back to slavery and the descendants of the enslaved people on the plantations. So the Mennonites come in and they buy land, right? And they bought a lot of land and they started farming. Well, it was early 1960s. So what the Mennonites dropped into, and they are, if people don't know as much about Mennonites, they're Anabaptist tradition. They're, and I'm not saying any of this disrespectfully at all, but they're pacifist. They don't like conflict. A number of other things, but that's relevant to this. So they drop into Mississippi right when the civil rights movement is getting going, right? And I found a wonderful piece that had been in a Mennonite quarterly by a religion historian that talked specifically about the Mennonites there. And they found themselves really caught between the racist white community, segregationist community that was fighting school integration, and Black people who they wanted to be kinder to, at least than the local whites. They wanted to pay them more, but the local whites said, no, you can't pay them more. And so they sent their kids to the public schools in the 60s. The public schools, the white public schools, the segregated schools. Okay. So they sent their kids there. But in 1970, when Alexander versus Holmes, which is Holmes County, by the way, one of our other counties, was ordered by the Supreme Court for schools to finally integrate, they decided to pull their kids out of the public schools and build their own schools. And this historian said, well, he's kind of saying it's really kind of suspect timing, right? So the bottom line, though, is that they do invite other people into their schools, as long as they play by their rules. And they're private schools. They have some Black kids, and you can see it on there. They have, I think, two schools in Noxabee County and a mission. I think that's the way it works. But they do, so they have some Black kids there. And other white kids who come to their schools. And then just like the segregation academies, over time, they started being called Christian schools instead of Mennonite schools. And with the segregation academies, they started being called Christian schools instead of being known for integration. So that's your little history lesson on Mennonites. But it's a mixed bag history, honestly. And there were some who were involved with the civil rights movement, and I talk about one of them in there. But what is really interesting about the Mennonites to me is that they were stuck between, like their businesses they wouldn't have been able to do business or to get bank loans if they had actually gotten involved in the civil rights movement. Now, I don't defend that because I think you do anyway, but I think that it's very true. And a lot of our project actually exposed situations like that, where in Noxabee County, white people who stood up for Black people would get in a lot of trouble, including beatings and sometimes even killed. So what's happened now, and Torsheta, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you've got, well, for one thing, all of the Noxabee County schools have closed except for the consolidated school in Macon for the whole county, one public school. Now, it's a fairly low population county, but still one public school system. It's all that's left. So Torsheta took me to abandoned school after abandoned school, or some that are being used for other things, but mostly abandoned around the county, just one after another. And then a lot of white people have left Noxabee County, and they've left Macon and such. And then Dr. McCloud, who is the clinical psychologist at the school, who Torsheta interviewed, and I talked to some, said that that there are people in there are teachers in the Noxabee County School District that actually send their kids to the white academies or to academies. And so one of the most poignant things that I think, I quoted this in the Central Academy thing, but one of the poignant things that they said is that it's not like this Central Academy closed in 2017 and then the kids just said, oh, okay, let's send our white kids back to the public school. They sent them to academies in other counties, like Kemper Academy. I mean, they're academies, they're segregation academies. And I'm sorry, that's how I call them that because that's how they started. And most of them are still overwhelmingly white. So do the math. But all of those counties around there have, like, there's Winston Academy, right, which is in Louisville or close to Louisville. And I think there are 2 segregation academies in Columbus, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, so, and then obviously there's Kemper Academy. So, yeah, so that's my very long answer to that. But I mean, it's just really tragic to think about that when white people fled their separate ways and, obviously try to take their resources with them. Oh, and I will say one more thing that a lot of people are noticing about the piece that I did about the white academies, which is basically in that story, Central Academy, as well as kind of talking about the private Mennonite schools. But even the Mennonites got in trouble for in the 70s for using tax funds in their schools. And they had to pay back money. So even the Mennonites got in trouble for violating, even because they were white only schools then. So they got in trouble as well. Central Academy got in a lot of trouble for trying to get tax money in the schools. And they decided to open that one back in 1964. They didn't open it to 1968, but they decided to open it in 1964. And all that's in the story. But yeah. And so, Torsheta, what would you say the sense of is why it closed in 2017?
I think they were down to about 17 students in K through 12 or less, maybe. Mm-hmm. So it closed essentially because they couldn't support it anymore. They didn't have enough students to I'm financially supported.
Yeah. Well, I'm here. I think that's a trend because, y'all have heard me, Kimberly's heard me talk about, Todd, my partner, and I've been driving during the pandemic, we've been to so many counties, right? And we always go find the segregation academy, and we find all the typical things, and then you never know when you'll need the pictures, uh, but the thing that I think is really true is that a lot of white people are leaving the areas, particularly the towns that a lot of these academies are in. So there's a rural white flight too, that I hadn't thought too much about to the last year, or year or two of seeing this. So when I say that, I mean like rural towns. All of Noxabee is pretty dang rural, even if they have towns, because and it's not like Macon is a metropolis, and that's the county seat, right? And so people leave, and then or their kids grow up, or whatever the case might be. And so what's happening is that I think they're running out. Some of these areas are just running out of kids to go to those schools. I just heard that in Lee Academy, which is in Coahoma County, Clarksdale. Somebody was in touch with me after they read this Central Academy story, and was saying that it's like they've become more diverse, kind of, because they only have 20 people in the senior class, and because so many white people have left. And then in the what am I trying to say? The elementary school, this man told me that it has no students left. Now, I would argue maybe that sounds like a good thing. Maybe that the well is drying up somehow on some of that, but I don't know if it's because all the sentiment's gone or not. It's not like people are enrolling more white kids in most of the public schools in these areas.
One of the other things that we found, especially in Noxabee County, people were leaving because the industry left.
Mhm.
There were so
Right.
many shuttered factories, and we visited several of them, and so there are no jobs. And so a lot of the people who may have stayed, both white and black, if you look at the population trend, the population has gone down, because there's really nowhere for them to work.
Mhm.
And when I talked to Dr. McCloud and even Shawanda, many of the people who live in the county have to work outside of the county. They have to travel
Mhm.
to Starkville or Columbus. I think Shawanda was traveling to a plant on the other side of maybe West Point to work, because there's really nowhere close
And that's a
for them
haul.
to work. It
That's not
is.
that's when you said West Point, I was like, gosh, you driving from to West Point? Wow.
One of I think the first night that I called her for an interview, she was driving home and it was raining, and so we postponed it. And she said it would take her about an hour or more than an hour to get home, and she had been on the road, I think, for a moment. So
Mhm. Well, and then the other thing is mechanization. Like when the Mennonites bought up the farmland, I mean, they farms in general, they don't need as many workers as they used to because of mechanization. And so a lot of the jobs, not that black people, as far as I can tell, black people were never paid well for farming in Noxabee County. I mean, literally, and if people go into the race violence sidebar, it's a long sidebar that, well, I can't find and stuff. But if you go into that one, you see that it was very intentional all the way back to Reconstruction, where uh, the white people who owned things and who ran. I mean, it's well-to-do white people and poor ones working together against black people, because poor whites didn't want black people to take their jobs, right? And so they would get upset about things, and then the well-to-do, the landowners, the plantation owners, um, the business owners, they literally, and we write about this in the series, they would do really bad things to anyone who in the beginning even sold land to black people, because they didn't want them to develop wealth. Um, and then like with the Mennonites, there were, at that time, I think Black people were making in Noxabee County an average of, I think it's in the story, but I think it's $3 a day for farming. And the Mennonites wanted to pay them more, right? And the local white, cabal wouldn't let them. And so, and white people on the banks and all this stuff, so it's like they wouldn't be able to get their loans to buy their equipment. You know what I mean? It's like, so and this is, ultimately this is the point of this series. And it's why our, going with Torsheta there was so, it made me think that this county's the center of the world at this moment, because of what it represents, because it was all systemic. I mean, this is the thing. Oh, and then the early, the terrorism that would happen against whites there who would try to help Black people in any way. The whippings and floggings and lynchings that happened to white people as well as Black people. Not as many, but everybody lived in fear of it. And so that's what the race violence piece is about. And also their campaign against schools. So Torsheta, since Dr. McCloud is not here, I'd love you to kind of tell the story of her telling, I mean, I think I was there for some of this too, but telling the story to you about her great grandmother and the attack on the school.
She recalls hearing the story. I think Donna brought this up and she read this in a piece somewhere about, and they never said who, but there was this riot, I guess, because the Blacks were about to demand more or better pay. And so over the course of, I think, 2 days or maybe 3 days, there were several murders, beatings, that type of thing. And so when we asked her about this, she recalled hearing her great grandmother talk about this. Her great grandmother worked in this school when she was very, very young at the time. At that time, you only went to school up until 7th, 8th grade. And then you helped out at the school. And so her great grandmother was helping out at the school. She was, quote unquote, teaching at the school. And they tell the story of this principal, this female school leader who was taken, and she said she didn't know if it was taken across the river, but there was some water involved, and they didn't know what happened to her. And so you can't completely tie it together, but you can almost put together that the story that Donna found about this school leader who was taken across the river and murdered is the same school leader that her great grandmother talked about.
Yeah.
So Torsheta,
Go ahead, Kimberly.
So growing up, what did you know about the race violence in your county?
Not much at all. And I said this to Donna when we started. She was finding these things and I was going, I didn't know this. I hadn't heard this. I grew up understanding that there was a distinct separation in the races. We didn't go to school together. We did not. There was no integration or mixing in anything. Like we didn't eat in the same restaurants, Of course, they owned several of the stores that we shopped in. And many of them were very kind to my parents and by default me, because, my mother and father were teachers, which makes you, of good standing in rural communities. But I distinctly know that there was a separation, but I didn't know much about the violence. And I don't know if it was because my parents just kept that away from me. They sheltered me from that, or if it was just something that wasn't talked about. I lean to more that it was something that wasn't talked about. I even asked my mother about some of the things that we found. My mother grew up she was born in Sugar Lock, grew up in Sugar Lock. Her parents, were there. She left and went to Russ College and came back. And even she would say, I don't remember that, or that wasn't talked about. Donna would come up with things and I would go ask my mom, and my mom is about to be 80. So, I mean, she's been there, and she would say, no, I don't remember that. I don't remember hearing that. I didn't hear about that. So I leaned to maybe it was just something that wasn't talked about. It wasn't discussed. It would happen and people just would be very hush hush about it.
other
can't hear
race.
you, Donna.
Oh, I unmute. Can you hear me now? Okay. What you find in a lot of these kind of situations with race violence, which, you know, I do a lot of research on, right? Is that, and it was certainly probably true here in Noxabee County, because if you read my very long sidebar about the race violence, not just Klan, but a lot of Klan violence, is that you see that it was such a campaign of white terror that people probably were too afraid to ever mention it very much, because even if they said it to somebody who then told somebody and it got back to the terrorist, they would come after them. I mean, it was that bad. I'm not exaggerating this. What I didn't know about Noxabee County, or really didn't know about Mississippi, and I thought I knew a lot about the Klan and all of this because of my homework. It wasn't really until we started doing this Noxabee work, and Torsheta could tell you that I went, you know, that that I fully understood that a lot of their early terror was very intentionally focused on schools, burning free schools, as they call them, early on, Black schools, especially educators, Black educators, but also white educators in Black schools would get beaten and flogged and whipped and threatened because they were very open about it. The newspapers then, the paper that is now called the Clarion Ledger, which back in the Reconstruction was the Daily Clarion, they were just very open that you couldn't teach Black people to read and write and to have an education, because then they would get involved politically, right? And I mean, I found a study that's in this race violence piece that it was just released this year. A Black woman researcher did this study that found that correlated counties with high lynchings like Noxabee County and so many in Mississippi. Hines and Lafayette were two of the highest ones with highest rates, by the way. But the ones that had high lynchings today tend to have low voter participation. And from the very beginning of it, it was purposeful. You know, all the BS about it being about white women, you know, so much of that was made up. They were just using all these white lynch mobs or terrorists would have to, and when I say terrorists, I mean the guy next door, you know, or the farm owner up the hill. But all they would have to do is say, "Oh, he tried to rape my daughter," and then the lynch mob would go to the jail and get him. I mean, that's all that you had to do, and so that you could make it up if you were worried about somebody who was trying to register to vote. And so what we found in Noxabee, and she keeps talking about how I would tell her, I'm like, you know, but that it was just Noxabee and those counties around it, Lowndes County, Kemper County, Chickasaw County, Winston County, a lot of those counties over there along the Alabama border. And let's not even talk about Alabama, because they were going back and forth over the border to do this stuff. They were considered the highest Klan infested counties in the state early on. And what I write about is they literally had congressional hearings in Macon about the Klan. And so a lot of the stories that I include in the sidebar on race violence were testimony from Black and white people about their experiences with race violence. Now, a lot of people might say, "Oh, well, that was way back then." No. Read the story, because it went from then I have stories from 1909, and then there are stories from 1919, which is when we think that riot happened that killed the principal. I say that, but I say in the story, I kind of make it clear that we don't know for sure, but it matches it. Her story matches what happened. And then the other thing I'll say, and then I kick it back to Kimberly to take it somewhere else or wherever you want it, but is that just they would take people across the Noxabee River, and I end with a story about that happened to a Black doctor. It ends up being an uplifting story. It's very tragic, but what happens with him is a resilient kind of thing. But this was in I think 1909. Yeah, this is what happens with him. Just read this while I talk. But he stood in front of white people at a concert, and a lynch mob tried to lynch him, and then burned his house, shot him. The police shot him and hit him over the head. And he ended up getting away, and he never returned. He went to Meridian, resettled, and became a real hero locally there, which you can see in front of you. But the point is, Noxabee County lost this amazing man because they ran him across the river. And so what Black people or anybody then can't know is how many Black people just ran in terror because of what they were doing to them, and how many of them were killed. And so, like with this woman principal, I've seen different stories about the 1919 one. Some people think she was killed, and some people think she was run off. I still don't know her name. And if there's anybody out there who could help us out with this, we would love to figure out more about that story. But, ultimately the point is the systemic, that it's just passed forward and passed forward and passed forward because we've never done anything to stop it. And so, like with Torsheta, showing me, literally taking me to all these places, that she's watched change while she was growing up, without real change ever happening. That was one of the most eye-opening days of my whole journalism career, was driving around her home county with her. I don't know if either one of you take this back, because I'm just like emoting.
It's fascinating, and I did tag various friends from Noxabee County in the Facebook Live, so maybe they have something to add. I'll just start tagging people. So one of the things, Donna and I had a meeting today to talk about some other work, and one of the things that occurred to me, and it hadn't occurred to me before, is the stress. We know that Black women bore the brunt of COVID, right? And so one of the things, and I'm sure, Torsheta, you're younger than I am, but one of the things we know is when you are middle class and Black, that you go become a teacher so you can become a principal, or you become a doctor or a nurse or a social worker, or you become a lawyer, or now you can become an engineer. Like, those are the four things. Those are your four secure job tracks. Don't be trying to do anything crazy out of that line, because we were teachers, but you must be better. So there's this whole, and if you say you come home to be a photographer, then there's a meeting because you've lost your mind. It's true. Torsheta knows it's true. There's a meeting. They have a meeting. And they call, and there's an aunt calling, going, "What are you doing?" Start a publication. What? My parents still don't know what they do. They're very confused. They're glad I can support myself, but they're very confused by my life.
I am a teacher right now because my father, I went to school to be a journalist. This is a true story. I went to school for journalism. My bachelor's degree is in mass communication. And when I left home, my father said, "You need a backup plan. You need a degree in education. They will always need teachers."
They will always need teachers. That's right.
So that is how I got into education. So that is very true.
So one of the things that had occurred to me when we were talking about the trauma that was happening with Black women in COVID is the industries that Black women of all socioeconomic backgrounds fall into, including education, healthcare, and the judicial system, which must continue to operate, right? So you have these people that still have to go to work, but still have to now do these extra responsibilities of trying to make sure these little people are getting education, and that their parents aren't roaming off from home. I almost installed a Ring doorbell at my parents' house because I ain't trust them. But you have all this stuff going on. What are some things that you heard from Black women about solutions that could have helped them cope better during the pandemic.
What was so interesting, and I end my piece with Dr. McCloud, who I think just summed it up perfectly. She said there was no plan. One of the things that we'll look at in our solutions pieces, Noxabee County was lacking the technology that it took to really be successful in virtual learning. And so you had students who didn't have computers, who didn't have iPads. Knoxville County is not a one-to-one school district. And for those of you who don't know what one-to-one means, that means that every student has a device. Knoxville County is not a one-to-one school district. And so they did not have devices. When I first came on to the BWC team, I'm a feature writer. This is deeper than I have ever dug for any story in my life. And it was fun, it was interesting, but it is definitely something very much out of my wheelhouse. But I came onto this and I talked about how we ended up with Dr. McCloud. I've already told you I'm an alumni. Well, when Noxabee County decided not to open their doors for the 2020 school year, she put out a call for alumni, her friends, members of her sorority, anyone who was willing to send devices, because the students didn't have devices. They didn't have iPads, they didn't have tablets or computers. And so we donated, we sent these. And so when Donna was talking about, Black women who were looking for solutions, she immediately came to mind because I knew for a fact that she had done that. And that was one of the biggest problems. Noxabee County did receive money from the CARES Act, but they didn't receive, like many counties in the state, I think they got the hotspots first in November and then the devices in December. Well, at that point, almost a whole semester of school has gone. And so one of the solutions that, definitely came out was the addition of technology. And that led to the broadband. It's, of course, a rural area. And Fort County is doing some amazing things, bringing some broadband into the area, but they didn't have broadband. A lot of the hotspots wouldn't work in the areas they were in because they're just so rural. So that was one of the solutions. The other solution that was very interesting that I heard one person say, when the Jackson Public School District closed, people in the Jackson area, teachers in the Jackson area, started opening these little, for lack of a better word, daycare, school care centers. And so there were places where people who still had to go to work could take their children and they could do their work. A number of them popped up across the city of Jackson. That didn't happen in Noxabee County. And so what you saw was, like Shawanda talks about, her mother who was retired would have to come over and sit with her children to make sure that they got their work done. One of the young ladies that I talked to for the solutions piece, the broadband piece, talked about her house became the gathering place because she had decent internet, but that meant that her 11th grade child became responsible for all of the cousins and the people who were younger than them, which the child was old enough, but not old enough.
Right.
And so that was something that there was nothing in place for those moms who still had to work, like you said, Kimberly, who had to make a living. And we looked at the amount of single parent households and female single parent households in that county, and it's a high number. So those mamas had to go to work, but there were no options for them for their children. And so they really had to lean on the community. They had to lean on neighbors and friends and whoever they could find to kind of help them. And I thought that was interesting that those types of care centers would pop up in Hinds County, but not in a county that is, and I say this because I'm from there, as closely knit and as community focused as Noxabee is.
And I wonder, you talk about these devices, and I'm giving people more. I'm giving y'all more work to do, so I'm just putting it out there. I am. So I have a friend who is on the cabinet in a large southern, really racially, economically diverse school district. It's huge. And they had devices ready, but I would say 60% of their school district didn't need the devices, but you didn't have to prove you needed devices. Kind of nobody cared if you brought the devices back. I have noticed that in places where the school district is poor, or the population is Black, there's like this almost police state about the devices. It's a Chromebook, it costs $200. Like, we want it back, but really, why don't we just give it to them like a textbook? So that's one thing I've noticed. I'd like to see how those pieces of equipment are treated in different areas. And then another, that's so interesting. I have no idea. And I will say, that our sub communities in Jackson obviously are very, very, very close. So if you look at the Queens, or Woodley, Woodhaven, those places can be close, that neighborhood. But that's interesting. I wonder if it was the broadband and people just thought, what do? I don't have anything to offer. Like, I don't have a device, I don't have proper internet. That's so interesting how that was so different. Because you would think that even the churches would have set up maybe even a study hall where you just come and be there with some adults during the day.
And I think I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go.
I think there were a couple of those options, but not nearly as many as there were in this area.
Right.
One of the things that I considered, though, I do know that many of them in the Hinds County area were expensive. Let me not say expensive, costly.
Right.
We looked into one here in the Hinds County area, and it was about, I guess you would say average daycare prices, which daycare prices are very, but $500 or $600 a week. Well, if you've had a child in a public school, if you're used to paying daycare, that doesn't faze you. But if you're not used to paying that, that's a big chunk of money. Yeah. I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not. Or maybe that just wasn't a thought. I do know there were a few things that happened there, but it was not on the scale of Noxabee County. I do know that I don't know how the devices were handled. I didn't ask. It didn't matter to me. I just wanted to help out my county. But I do know that, from looking at her thank yous and her responses, a lot of alumni reached out to buy devices and send devices back. So there was an overwhelming response to that outcry of help. But a lot of us, and I'm going to be honest, don't live there anymore. I looked at a lot of the people who donated, that we don't live there anymore. So that also makes a huge difference.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, my high school, which is Callaway High School, which is a JPS school, I guess you had to pay $50 to get an iPad or a Chromebook or something, and some of the kids didn't have the $50. I was like, I know y'all not making these children pay $50, but whatever. Don't get me started on making people pay money for it, or something that is like a textbook. So we got together, and it wasn't that many kids. I would say maybe 15 to 20% of the kids couldn't pay the $50 to get the device. And again, this is an alumni that is affluent. There's, it was an easy ask, but it's one of those things where, why don't get me started on school funding, because I will be here all day. It's this idea that education is not a right. And be very clear, broadband is a utility. It should be we should have broadband everywhere. It's like electricity. You can't function without the internet these days. You can't pay. There's hardly, do people, where do you go pay your bills in person? Very few places, right? It's like, where do you go? They hardly don't want you in the tag place to go buy your car tag. There's this whole idea of commerce happens online, education happens online. So it's interesting, it's part of the poor tax. You live in a poor school system, you don't have broadband, you don't have a device. Years ago, I had a friend and they were in an affluent school but they hadn't started doing online learning or turning in their assignments online. And she said her child was at an extreme disadvantage when they got to school, when they got to college, because she didn't have the skill set to operate in that. Because they go to class, but you turn in everything online, you discuss everything online. So it's interesting because I think that that COVID created that magnified that disparity. You can't. That's right, Brian. You can't apply for a job without internet. You can't apply for a job at the grocery store without internet. They do not want you walking in there. That was my rant.
One of the other things about Noxabee County is a state takeover school district. One of the reasons they were taken over by the state was because of financial problems. So they already had fiscal issues. So I think that may have played a big part into having devices, technology, one-to-one, how money was being spent. I haven't dug very deeply into. I do know that at the time there were about 88 or so violations that ended up putting them into school improvement. But I know one of the biggest ones was the mismanagement of funds or fiscal irresponsibility. And so I wonder how much of that may have played a part in them not having the technology that I know from being a teacher is kind of common in a lot of schools. But I also know, again, it's a rural area. And so if you're a rural area and you don't have a lot of access to broadband internet, it doesn't do you a lot of good to have a Chromebook or an iPad. If you're in a rural area and you don't have internet, you really can't use it. So it's almost a...
Yeah.
Well, I would argue there, and maybe this is, we can kind of summarize it up this way anyway, but I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this since your reporting and the broadband issue, for instance. And I think to me, it goes back to the bigger picture of the will and, having the will or the urgency to make sure that all of our kids have access to the tools that they need for success, right? Much less our adults, but certainly our kids. And sure, spending as much time as I spent reading testimony about violence in order to shut down schools and to stop Black education can have an effect on you. And I'm still kind of processing a lot of that. But what I will say to y'all is that people in power for a long time have known that education is a way for other people to step up and to demand more power. And so I think that's what we're talking about here with these inequities are so intentional. And that's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, read these pieces as Torsheta and I kind of go through and connect the dots for Noxabee County's history and what efforts there were to stop progress and voting and advancement. And so I guess what I'm saying here, it's not so much as an editorial as saying to challenge people. The reason we're doing this kind of hard work, right, Torsheta? It is more than a feature story, and you're a natural at it, by the way. We're doing this hard work to help people connect these dots, and not as a way to blame backward, but as a way to solve things going forward. But we need to know what's happening here. We can't blame whole communities for their own disparities when they weren't the ones that put them there in the first place. Okay. And that's what we do so often as a nation, a state, and communities, or even, even within communities that can happen. Blame crime, for instance, some of these other things. And so that's kind of my challenge to folks is to read these pieces, try to read them with an open mind, and just think about how one thing leads to another, leads to another. And then if we don't do anything to kind of solve the broadband issue, you know, rural or not, people need broadband. It's a utility, like Kimberly says. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do. We do have these two other counties coming, Hinds County, public safety and crime. You may ask what that has to do with COVID-19. Well, stay tuned, and we will try to help explain that. And then healthcare in Holmes County. We hope to be adding more counties soon as we do the systemic reporting. Torsheta is working on solutions pieces that are going to follow up the work that we've done so far. So if you have any ideas or thoughts, please get in touch with us. We're not that hard to find. We'd love to hear from you, whether or not you're in Noxabee County. If you're interested in solution circles, we have on November 15th, we have another Black Women and COVID solution circle coming up. And one way to get involved with that is solutions at MississippiFreePress.org. Solutions at MississippiFreePress.org. We want to hear from people. You know, not all of these solution circles are only Black women. I don't attend those. They are very honest conversations. Kimberly's in a lot of them, or maybe all of them. But you know, join us as we spread around these solution circles, and eventually won't be on Zoom, because this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand our state and to try to get people talking to each other about causes and solutions. And that's at the core of the reporting that, you know, what we believe in at the Mississippi Free Press. By the way, you can support our work. How about that for a segue? You can support our work on our brand new donation portal, which is kind of fun, as you'll see if you go there. It's at the same link. It's at mfp.ms/donate. And we're in our news match season. Right now, we have a triple match going from news match, as well as two readers who put together $2,000. So for that $2,000, any donation to we've brought in, that full $2,000 is tripled. So it becomes $6,000. So please, we welcome. $5 becomes 15. You know, 50 becomes 150, and you take it from there. So this is going to be going on between now and the end of the year. And, you know, our resources are going into people to do this great reporting and the expenses of it. We are coming to a county near you to do this systemic reporting. I mean, just count on it. This is what we're doing. We call it Mapping Mississippi, going county by county, issue by issue. And so please help us do this work if you can. Give us your feedback. You know, just stay involved, please. We're all about the causes and solutions. And then next week, we're going to have the guests that were going to be here this week, but they had to reschedule. We're going to be talking about inequity in healthcare, and particularly the efforts to bring to make the reach of the state health department and more. I'm sorry, I'm not talking well now, but to make it more equitable, to reach more people from vaccines to other healthcare needs. I think the state, my guess, we will ask these gentlemen next week, but my guess is that the state is stepping up more than it ever has with the health department on equity issues because of what COVID-19 revealed. That's my sense. And just like we're trying to do, we're trying to, you know, look at what it revealed in search of solutions. So we can't wait to see them next week. And anything I forgot, Kimberly?
It's all right. Just remember that match is tripled. So let's make it go away and start a new match.
That's right. We're trying to grow our reporting team. And I will say it again, read Torsheta Jackson. She said that this was a new kind of work for her, but I'm really hoping to keep her going on this kind of deep reporting because she is just a natural at it. So it was great to talk to you guys tonight, and we'll see everybody next week. Watch us online.